If you always wake between 3 and 4 in the morning, the hour when the house is quietest and the world feels most thin, Edgar Cayce's archives suggest that something is trying to speak to you. Not every waking at that hour has meaning. Sometimes it's a cup of coffee, stress, or a restless body. But across thousands of documented trance readings, Cayce described that hour as a hinge between worlds, a time when the veil loosens and the soul is more able to shift its attention beyond the strictly physical. If you've been nudged awake in that window, this is an invitation to listen with care, discernment, and a readiness for service. Edgar Cayce was a Kentucky-born man who became known in the early 20th century as the sleeping prophet. In trance, he gave thousands of readings on healing, reincarnation, dream symbolism, and spiritual development, material now housed in what scholars and seekers call the Cayce Archives. In those records, Cayce approached dreams not as random images, but as a language the soul uses to communicate, symbolic windows, rehearsals, and sometimes direct transmissions of insight or guidance. Across his work, he identified recurring patterns, dream types that, when recognized, point to a specific gift, a life task, or an unresolved thread in the soul's journey. Before we go deeper, a quick note. The material that follows is reported from Cayce's readings as recorded in the archives. It is not offered as scientific proof. It is archival testimony and a map some people have found remarkably useful. If you experience persistent sleep disruption or distress, consult medical or mental health professionals alongside your spiritual practice. Spiritual experience can be profound, but it doesn't replace responsible care. If the idea that your nights might be telling you something resonates, consider subscribing to this channel for more archival readings explained and practical steps you can try. Now, let's look at what Cayce called the 7 spiritually significant dream types and how they relate to that thin hour between 3 and 4. Cayce's classification of dreams is not merely a taxonomy, it is a diagnostic lens. He observed that certain images and motifs repeat in the lives of people who go on to develop specific spiritual capacities. The dream, in Cayce's framing, can be a training ground, sometimes a rehearsal for a gift, sometimes a warning, sometimes a retrieval of memory from another life. When you place those dreams against the backdrop of the late-night hours, especially that 3 to 4 a.m. window, a pattern emerges. The soul often does its quiet work when the body's usual defenses are down. Type 1. Flying and levitation dreams. Access to higher consciousness. Definition and sense. The flying dream is the most cinematic of the categories. One rises above Earth, glides over cities or deserts, sometimes even over monuments like pyramids or cathedrals.
Cayce read these dreams as an expression of a soul beginning to access higher centers of consciousness. In his terms, these experiences often indicate an opening in what contemporary readers might call the crown center, an increased receptivity to insight that transcends ordinary thought. What it indicates. Flying dreams point to a widening field of perception. A person may gain prophetic vision, clairvoyant impressions, or an ability to synthesize symbolic patterns. This isn't a promise of theatrical prophecy, but rather a heightened capacity to receive images and impressions that can be translated into guidance for service. A compact archival case. One woman documented in the archives as Margaret reported recurrent dreams of flying over great structures, most vividly over pyramidal forms silhouetted against a strange light. According to the reading given in her trance session, those dreams corresponded with an earlier life exposure to temples and ceremonial knowledge. As Margaret's life unfolded, she found herself increasingly drawn to symbolic study and prophetic interpretation. Small, truthful intuitions about people and situations came with a clarity that startled her friends. Friends and clients spoke of a steadiness in her counsel that was less personal opinion and more an apprehension of pattern. The archives record that this gift, when oriented toward service, counseling, ethical leadership, quiet teaching, grew and deepened. When it became about personal acclaim, Cayce's readings warned, the impressions dulled. Signs to recognize. If your flying dreams return with intensity, notice how they land in your waking life. Do you find yourself suddenly understanding complex symbolic connections? Do stray images in the night resolve into practical insight during the day? Do people come to you for calm, clarifying words? These are the tracers of a gift seeking service. If the dreams make you feel superior, competitive, or isolated, treat them as a red flag. Cayce emphasized that spiritual openings flourish in humility and usefulness, not in pride. Type 2. Water and drowning dreams, currents of healing. Definition and sense. Water in dreams carries ancient weight. It cleanses, it carries, it obscures and reveals. Cayce noted a cluster of water dreams, immersion, standing at the edge of deep lakes, carrying water in vessels, that often accompanied an emerging healing capacity. Some dreamers described being hands-on with water, bathing others, drawing water that glowed, or passing their hands through liquid light. What it indicates: dreams where water is primary were, in many of Cayce's readings, signs of magnetic healing aptitude. That is, a person learning to direct life force in therapeutic ways, laying on of hands, balancing energies, guiding others through emotional or physical restoration.
The dream functioned both as a rehearsal and a reassurance. The soul rehearsed to the medium of healing, and waking life then offered the ethical and practical workground to refine that potential. A compact archival case. James Thompson, catalogued in the archives, woke repeatedly from dreams of wading through clear, cool water while carrying a small satchel of herbs and stones. In his readings, Cayce described this imagery as a symbol of the magnetic and hands-on nature of his healing function. Over time, Thompson became a community healer, not a headline-making miracle worker, but a steady presence who, through touch, steady counsel, and precise herbal knowledge passed down in family memory, helped many stabilize chronic suffering. The readings consistently framed his gift as a responsibility, to use it for service, to practice self-care, and to refuse fee structures or publicity that would turn healing into performance. Signs to recognize. If water dreams are recurrent, ask, does your body lean toward caring roles? Do you find peace when you help restore balance to someone tired or anxious? Do you work with touch, aroma, or rhythm in ways that comfort people? Again, discernment is key. Vivid water imagery can also relate to emotional processing, unresolved grief, or physical sleep disturbances. A medical check for sleep apnea or nocturnal reflux is not a betrayal of spiritual curiosity. It is careful stewardship of the vessel. Type 3. Ancient civilization and temple dreams, memory retrieval. Definition and sense. Dreams of cities that are not modern, of temples, crystalline structures, or technologies unlike anything in daily life, form the third class. These nocturnal scenes often come with an uncanny sense of familiarity. The dreamer recognizes a corridor, a tool, or a tone without ever having encountered it in this lifetime. What it indicates. In Cayce's framework, these dreams frequently represent access to what he called the records, the soul's memory of prior incarnations and the cultural technological matrices those lives inhabited. For some, these dreams seed an ability to recall or reanimate specialized knowledge. A musician suddenly feels at home with a long-forgotten scale, a craftsman intuitively understands an ancient method, or a healer gains insight into materials and forms used millennia ago. A compact archival case. David Kahn's case in the archives is one such instance. He would wake with the sound of clear, resonant tones in his ears and the sensate memory of standing before a crystalline array that seemed to answer to pitch. Cayce's reading for David suggested this imagery was linked to an Atlantean priestly role involving sound and vibration as therapeutic tools. In the decades following his readings, David found himself drawn to experimental sound therapy and the study of crystal resonance. The people who sought his practice reported a deep, arresting calm.
The archives are careful to present this not as absolute proof of Atlantis, but as a pattern where the dream served to reacquaint a soul with prior modalities of service. Signs to recognize. When ancient architecture dreams recur, pay attention to the skills and interests you cannot explain. Sudden affinities for certain materials, inexplicable comfort with unfamiliar instruments, or a quiet knowledge that draws you toward a discipline. These nudges may be invitations to study, to adapt, and to place forgotten skills in the service of present needs. Type 4. Dreams of deceased guides, direct visitations. Definition and sense. Some dreams present figures who speak with precise authority, a grandmother who knew things beyond family lore, a sage who offers specific names, places, or remedies. These are not vague impressions but pointed communications, often accompanied by sensory details that the dreamer later verifies in waking life. Cayce wrote that when a dream includes accurate, verifiable information that the dreamer could not have known ordinarily, this points to genuine spiritual contact. What it indicates. Dreams of deceased guides often come as confirmation, instruction for healing practices, or the passing of lineage knowledge. These visitations serve both to console and to instruct. They might come in the night to redirect the dreamer's vocational path, or to supply a missing piece of skill needed to help others. A compact archival case. Mary Patterson's files include recurring dreams of an older woman at a garden gate who would instruct Mary on the preparation of poultices and the identification of plants. The reading suggested the woman was a familial ancestor or guide passing along practical herbal knowledge. When Mary followed the recipes, she found relief for neighbors and eventually gathered a modest practice offering accessible plant-based remedies for common ailments. The archives emphasize that the presence of verifiable information, a forgotten recipe, a place name no one in the family recognized, strengthens the case for an authentic visitation. Signs to recognize. If the post-dream morning brings precise, checkable details, a plant name you later confirm, an address you find in an old ledger, a skill that appears as if taught, treat it seriously. Cayce's counsel, as reflected in his readings, was to test such experiences, verify, apply with prudence, and always orient the result towards service rather than self-aggrandizement. A thread between the types. Notice the through line. Whether it's flying, water, temples, or a wise voice at your bedside, Cayce's archival pattern ties these experiences to gifts. That does not mean every dream is a spiritual mission. The archives themselves are filled with readings that remind sleepers to take care of their bodies, to seek medical advice when needed, and to use common sense in deciphering nocturnal images.
Spiritual openings are most often modest at first, small recognitions that require cultivation. The Veil and the Nightly Review. Now return to the hour. Cayce repeatedly described the night as a time of review and recalibration. The soul, he suggested, uses sleep to shift attention away from the sensory demands of the body and to enter a field where connections to other souls, archetypal patterns, and the so-called records are more accessible. 3 to 4 in the morning, across many cultures, has held a reputation as especially liminal. Cayce's readings align with that. He reported that in those hours, the soul can be keenly active, sometimes rehearsing scenes, sometimes revisiting decisions, occasionally undergoing a condensed life review. He often used bold imagery, the soul standing at its own funeral, the quiet panorama of one's life laid before the inner eye, the hall where impressions of all deeds are recalled and felt. These are not punitive visions in Cayce's telling. They are educational. The point of the review is not condemnation, but recognition, to let the soul experience the consequences of choices in order to inform future ones. Waking at 3 in the morning may be a nightly micro version of this process, a brief moment when the soul notices things you have not been noticing, or an hour where unresolved threads tug so strongly you cannot continue sleeping until you have acknowledged them. A pause for responsibility. It's crucial to distinguish poetic description from medical diagnosis and to insist upon the measures of prudence. Frequent awakenings in that window can be symptoms of insomnia, stress, hormonal shifts, or sleep disorders. Cayce's counsel often paired spiritual explanation with practical care. Meditate, journal, sit with a trusted helper, and consult physicians when the body suffers. The spiritual life, he insisted, is never a reason to neglect the body's needs. Where dream types meet the review. Many of the dream motifs described earlier, flying, water, ancient architecture, guides, often appear in Cayce's material around the subject of life review. For some sleepers, the visions that woke them at 3 a.m. were not isolated images, but components of a nightly partial review, in which the soul replays motifs relevant to its learning. A person who has recurring water dreams might find that their 3 to 4 a.m. awakening includes scenes of healing they performed in life or opportunities they missed. A flyer might relive moments of inspiration, noticing whether they shared insight or hoarded it for status. The review is intimate and corrective. It shows not to punish, but to illuminate. A case in the archives recounts a man who woke at that hour for several nights running and described with astonished clarity standing at his own funeral. He saw relatives who had been slaves to petty grievances and the small acts of kindness he had neglected.
Cayce's reading suggested that this nocturnal rehearsal was prompting a redirection in waking life. The man stopped postponing reconciliations and began making amends in simple ways. Again, the emphasis is service. The inner knowledge the review offers is meant to steer the soul toward greater love and usefulness, not toward fear. A warning embedded in the wonder. Cayce's archives also contain a caution. Spiritual openness can be misused. Recurrent awakenings that lead to vanity, to seeking power over others, or to a hunger for specialness can become corrosive. Several readings note that when talents are hoarded, commercialized without integrity, or used to manipulate, the soul's access diminishes. Gifts are measured by use.
A person awakened at 3 in the morning who uses the insight to comfort, heal, teach, or relieve burden aligns with the archive's highest recommendations. One who uses it for egoic advantage risks losing the very sensitivity they thought they'd gained. A morning ritual for discernment. For those who sense that the veil is thinning for them, Cayce's material suggests simple, repeatable practices to test and develop what appears in the night. If you wake at 3 or shortly after, take a moment to breathe, to ground by placing your feet on the floor, and to remain calm. Panic will shut the experience down. Keep a small notebook or a voice recorder by the bedside. Capture images, words, and feelings immediately. The archives show repeatedly that the clearer the documentation, the better the discernment later. Pray or attune briefly to your highest sense of right action. Cayce often recommended a short, sincere attunement to the Christ light or to the highest moral ideal you hold. Frame this as a request. Let what comes be for service. These are not guarantees. They are starters, practices intended to foster wisdom rather than spectacle. Crossing into the afterlife material. As readers of Cayce will note, his descriptions of death and the afterlife are rich with images that echo the dream material. Halls of records, life reviews, and encounters with what he called the Christ light, a term he used to describe a transformative meeting with a presence of pure love and consciousness. When sleepers report waking in the thin hour with a taste of that light, Cayce's archives counsel a careful humility. The experience points toward a capacity for love greater than self-interest. It is at this point, the intersection of private nocturnal images and the expansive afterlife motifs, that many seekers feel unease. Are these visions literal? Are they symbolic? Are they a mix? Cayce's stance, as reflected across readings, is pragmatic. The archive offers descriptive testimony, not rigid doctrine. Some people will find in these nocturnal lights a path to deeper service. Others will find a mirror for their anxieties. Both responses are part of the terrain. A longer example.
One woman cataloged in the archives recounted a sequence that began with small dreams and culminated in a vivid 3 to 4 a.m. communion. She dreamed repeatedly of walking through a courtyard lined with columns, each column carved with scenes of daily life. Over several nights, the carvings changed and began to display scenes she recognized as choices she had made, kindnesses withheld, moments of courage taken. On the final night of the sequence, she awakened weeping with relief. She had, in the dream, offered apologies to people she had wronged. The reading suggested that this was a waking rehearsal for repairing her relationships. In the months that followed, she described a quieter life, less driven by resentment and more inclined towards service in a small community clinic. The archive frames this not as miraculous transformation in one night, but as the effect of a soul that had used dream evidence to alter waking choices. Why 3 to 4? Tradition, physiology, and symbolism mingle here. Many spiritual traditions have labeled the late-night hours as liminal. Many cultures interpret the dark, still hours as a time when spirits are closer. Cayce's readings put it in personal terms. When the brain's sensory intake is lowered, the soul's awareness naturally widens. The archive also reflects that the psychological state of a person, including unresolved grief, intense vocation, or deep moral questioning, predisposes one to nocturnal openings. The hour itself is a catalyst, not a guarantee. A practical caution: if you find yourself waking nightly at 3, pair curiosity with care. Keep a log of sleep patterns and consult a physician if there are signs of a sleep disorder, chronic fatigue, or cognitive disturbance. Spiritual experiences become most beneficial when they are integrated into a life that honors both inner insight and outward responsibility. A question in the dark: if you are one of those people who rises regularly in the thin hour, ask, what are you being asked to do with what you see? Is the imagery inviting repair, service, study, or action? Or is it a call to hide, to consume attention, or seek novelty? The archive's moral insistence is that ability divorced from humility deteriorates. And yet there is a gentleness in Cayce's descriptions that must be preserved. The readings are not condemnations from on high. They are more like coaching notes. Gifts are given, and the world asks for them back in the form of service. If the veil is thin for you at 3 a.m., consider that you may be being trained, slowly, insistently, to turn what you receive into offerings for others. The next part of this conversation will examine more of the dream types and move deeper into what Cayce called the Hall of Records and the soul's encounter with the Christ light.
We'll look at prophetic dreams and dreams of vocation, and we'll consider how Cayce framed the modern era.
particularly his archival material on past lives and what some interpreters call an Atlantean return, as a moment demanding moral clarity. For now, if you have had dreams that feel like instructions rather than images, hold them gently, document them, test them against kindness. When the night wakes you, listen for what urges you toward love, and be suspicious of anything that directs you toward power for its own sake. Type 5. Prophetic and warning dreams, signals of imminence. Definition and sense. There is a group of dreams that arrive less as private images and more like urgent dispatches, scenes that feel stamped with forward motion, details that later line up with events, and an emotional tone that says, prepare. Cayce's archives contain numerous accounts of sleepers who received warnings in dreams, sometimes subtle, sometimes startling, and whose lives were altered because they heeded or ignored what they were shown. These are not theatrical premieres of fate. They are, in the archives language, possibilities made vivid so that a responsible human might choose differently. What it indicates. Prophetic dreams, in Cayce's framing, often point to a role in communal care. The sleeper is being shown a future threat so that they might minister practically, by warning, by preparation, by intervening in small ways that reduce suffering. The gift implied is not a license for grand pronouncements, but a call to responsible forethought and grounded communication. A compact archival case. Eleanor Walsh's readings are a classic example recorded in the archives. She described a sequence of nights in which she repeatedly dreamed of crowded marketplaces and people counting their coins with shaking hands. The dreams arrived months before the financial panic of 1929. According to her readings, the nocturnal images were a warning of systemic stress and human fear. They prompted her to act quietly, helping neighbors organize small savings, encouraging practical thrift among friends, and supporting a local relief group that later eased acute hardship in her town. The readings do not present Eleanor's dreams as a guarantee that forecasting was her highest calling. Instead, they frame the dream as a moral summons. If the night shows you impending trouble, use the information to protect and to serve, not to profit from panic or to hoard advantage. Signs to recognize. If your dreams carry an urgency, numbers, places, sequences that later match real events, test them with care. Verify details where possible. Ask trusted friends or mentors to help you discern whether the dream points to concrete steps you can take to help others. Be wary of any impulse to monetize a warning or to create fear for attention. Cayce's readings consistently recommend aligning such nocturnal knowledge with communal well-being rather than personal gain.
Type 6. Dreams of healing, being the healed and the healer. Definition and sense. Distinct from water dreams, this category centers directly on the act of healing. Dreams in which the dreamer is healed of an ailment, observes the mechanism of healing, or performs restoration on another person. These are often vivid, tactile, and suffused with a sense of correct alignment, bones knitting, colors balancing, warmth moving through the body. What it indicates. The archives show that such dreams commonly herald a vocation in therapeutic care. The gift is practical. The sleeper may discover a sensitivity to others' bodily or emotional states, a capacity to soothe, or an aptitude for modalities that integrate touch, breath, and attention. Cayce's readings often tied these dreams to the development of what he called magnetic or laying on of hands healing, clinic-level work grounded in humility and steady practice. A compact archival case. Robert Chen, whose files are preserved in the Cayce collection, reported a pool of dreams where he both received healing and gave it. In one recurring image, he saw his hands glowing with a soft copper light as he placed them above a neighbor's chest. In another, he felt a precise, cool pressure moving along a spine. The reading associated these nocturnal rehearsals with a practical trajectory. Robert trained quietly in massage and community care, learning anatomy, developing restraint, and refusing sensationalism. The archive records that his work helped many with chronic tension and sleep disruption. Again, the point in the readings is not to promise miraculous cures, but to show that dream patterns can indicate real-world aptitudes that, when trained and ethically deployed, ease suffering. Signs to recognize. If you wake with restored pain, or if you dream of applying a specific touch or method, notice whether you are drawn to study therapeutic arts, to be present with suffering, and to practice restraint. A clear test in the archive is verifiability. Does applying a learned or dream-inspired technique relieve someone in a modest, reproducible way? If so, the dream likely points to a pastoral or therapeutic call. Always pair such experiments with appropriate medical guidance and training. Type 7. Direct contact with higher intelligence, the Christ consciousness encounters. Definition and sense.
The final category in Cayce's classification is the most ineffable: dreams in which a presence of unmistakable love and clarity speaks, teaches, or simply radiates a quality that reorganizes a person's priorities. Cayce used the term Christ consciousness to describe these encounters, language he chose to indicate not doctrinal specificities, but a pattern of transpersonal love, insight, and healing that resembles what he understood of the Christ ideal. These dreams often leave the sleeper with a luminous moral clarity and a renewed sense of purpose. What it indicates.
Dreams with direct contact to higher intelligence, as reported in the archives, often precipitate a whole life realignment. The individual may develop a vocation of teaching, pastoral care, or sustained service that places love as the central metric of success. Cayce's readings present these experiences as less about prestige or psychic exhibition and more about a reorientation. Life is to be lived as a practice of compassion and redemption. A compact archival case, Martha Johnson's files include recurring transformative dreams of a figure of light who did not always speak in words, but conveyed a depth of relational knowledge, how one's motives register in others, the small ways kindness reshapes community, the gentle courage of consistent service. The readings connected these nocturnal visitations to Martha's subsequent life choice to work in small, steady ministries, visiting the sick, running literacy programs, and offering counsel without charge. The archives emphasize that Martha's dreams did not make her immune to errors. Rather, they gave her a tool to prioritize love and correct course when she drifted toward attracting attention rather than offering care. Signs to recognize. After such dreams, ask whether your life posture has shifted toward others. Does daily interaction feel more like service than transaction? Are you increasingly restless with anything that elevates you at another's expense? If so, treat the dream as a call to sustained moral refinement. Linking the 7 types back to the thin hour. We have returned often to that single hinge hour, 3 to 4 in the morning, because Cayce's readings place it at the heart of nocturnal receptivity. The 7 dream types often surface most vividly in that window. A prophetic image may arrive at 3:13 a.m. A water dream rehearsal could culminate with a tactile insight at 3:47. A Christ-light visitation might puncture the night at 3:02. The archive's consistent pattern is that the body's reduced sensory chatter at those hours gives the soul a clearer field to project instruction, rehearsal, or recall. Yet Cayce and those recorded in the archives consistently balance this awe with prudence. Not every late-night waking carries sacred import. The Life Review expanded. What the archive reveals about death, memory, and return. Cayce's material on death reads like an extended mirror held up to life. The Life Review, as he described it, is neither an arbitrary snapshot nor a moral tribunal. It is education. The soul, freed briefly from the body, perceives the ripples it created: small cruelties, withheld generosity, real bravery, unnoticed sacrifices. The archives contain accounts of sleepers who, in their nocturnal reviews, or in dreams that resembled such reviews, felt the recoil of a harsh word or the tender echo of an uncelebrated kindness.
In one recurring motif, dreamers reported watching scenes from the perspectives of those they had affected, an almost unbearable empathy that prompted tangible restitution when they returned to waking life. The Hall of Records, another frequent image in Cayce's readings, functions as a storehouse of impressions. The archival language is metaphorical. What is seen in the hall is not a ledger of reward and punishment, but an accessible set of impressions that explain motive and consequence. To be invited into this hall is to be shown the connective tissue of causality, how a minor choice ripples outward. The archive frames the hall not as a threat, but as a potent teacher. There is also a repeated depiction of encounter, the soul meeting what Cayce called the Christ light. This meeting is often described as piercingly loving and informative. The archive stresses that such an encounter does not erase responsibility, it clarifies it. The Christ light, in Cayce's vocabulary, reveals a priority structure. Love and service are the axis upon which spiritual progress hinges. Dreamers who felt this light often return to life with a renewed appetite for humility and practical care. Importantly, the archive records that these nocturnal and post-mortem experiences are meant to be formative rather than escapist. The Life Review is not a replacement for repentance done in the body. It seeds waking change. For those whose nights are punctuated by review-like scenes at 3 to 4 in the morning, the invitation is to let revelation translate into action: apology, repair, discipline, service. The dream that wakes you is training you in moral craft. Reincarnation, Atlantis and the Prophecy of Transition, 1998 to 2025. One of the more controversial themes in Cayce's readings is the idea of recurrent lifetimes and a particular emphasis on Atlantean pasts for some souls. The archives contain narrative threads in which certain dream motifs, temples, crystalline instruments, and oceanic cities are linked to prior incarnations in cultures not part of our documented history. Cayce frames such material as a type of soul memory, not proof of a specific archaeology, but an internal record that can inform vocational aptitudes and moral debts. When the archives speak of Atlantis, they do so tentatively, in terms of psychic retrieval rather than archaeological certainty. For readers who find these images compelling, the invitation is practical. If you feel drawn to technologies, arts, or healing methods that have no clear origin in your upbringing, study them responsibly. See if they can be translated into ethical service for the present age. Closely related to this is Cayce's archival pattern reading about epochs of spiritual testing. Across certain readings, he spoke of a period of transition. Interpreters often point to the years roughly bracketed by 1998 to 2025 as a time of intensified choice for humanity.
The archive frames this not as deterministic doom, but as a pressure point. More opportunities and more risks will be present, and how individuals respond will matter. In Cayce's voice as represented in the readings, the prescription is persistent. Use gifts for community uplift, cultivate humility, and refuse shortcuts to power. If you are wrestling with the Atlantean imagery or with the idea of a modern transition, treat these as moral prompts rather than esoteric bragging rights. The archive's stress is ethical. Remembering a prior life is useful only insofar as it helps one repair, teach, or heal now. The prophecy-like statements about our era are archive invitations to wake up morally, not to predict dates for salvation or ruin. Practical steps from the archives, a 7-day opening plan. Cayce's readings are full of pragmatic counsel. For someone who wakes repeatedly between 3 and 4 in the morning and suspects the veil may be thin, the archives recommend a combination of documentation, attunement, training, and service. Below is a modest, serious 7-day plan distilled from near consistent archival advice. This is a starter sequence, not a panacea, and it ought to be adapted to your circumstances and to whatever medical or psychological care you may require. Day 1. Prepare the vessel. Place a small notebook and pen beside your bed and a glass of water. Before sleep, set a simple intention. If I am shown anything tonight, let it be for service. Sleep with an awareness of bodily comfort. Correct any obvious sleep disruptors, lighting, caffeine, screen time. Day 2. Record immediately. If you wake between 3 and 4, do not judge. Breathe, note the time, and write down images, words, colors, and emotions. Even a single phrase, stone in a river, can be a key. If you cannot write, speak into a recorder. The archives repeatedly show that immediate documentation preserves detail. Day 3. Test for practicality. Review your notes. Is there something verifiable? A plant name, an address, a technical term? If there is, take a small ethical step to test it. Look the plant up, check the ledger, ask a trusted elder. The archive advises caution. When testing, be modest and do not profit from the experiment. Day 4. Begin 10-minute attunement. Each morning or evening, sit for 10 minutes in stillness. Use a simple prayer or orienting phrase. Cayce often suggested an attunement to the Christ-light or to the highest good, and ask that any gifts you receive be given only for service. This daily practice creates a moral habit, training impulse and discipline. Day 5. Study with intent. Choose a single subject that your dream patterns point toward. Herbalism, basic anatomy, sound therapy, scriptural study, and commit 10 minutes of reading each day. The archives show that study grounds dream impressions in competence. Day 6. Small service act.
Perform one small, tangible act of service that week. Visit an elder, volunteer an hour in a clinic, share a skill. The readings emphasize that gifts that are practiced in service deepen and mature. Day 7. Community and reflection. Share a single dream with a trusted friend or mentor. Invite their perspective without seeking validation. Reflect on what shifted over the week. Are you clearer about a vocation? Have any physical or psychological issues surfaced that require professional follow-up? This plan is intentionally modest. The archive's consistent emphasis is that development happens incrementally and within community. Do not rush toward spectacle. Use dreams to cultivate usefulness. A ritual sequence to apply when you wake at 3 to 4 a.m. If you are awakened in that thin hour and you want a reliable sequence to respond wisely, inventories from the archives suggest the following 4-step ritual. These are small, practical motions intended to ground, document, discern, and act. First, ground. Place feet on the floor, breathe deeply 3 times, and say aloud, if that helps, I center in love and service.
This is not magic, it is a physiological cue to reduce panic and reopen discernment. Second, document. Record the images, words, or sense impressions immediately. Even fragments matter. Third, attune. Offer a brief request. If this is for the highest good, let it guide me to help. This frames the nocturnal content within ethical intention rather than personal intrigue. Fourth, act small. If you perceived a specific prompting, call a neighbor, look up a plant, send a text of reassurance, translate the nocturnal insight into a modest, concrete act. The archives repeatedly show that small actions often validate or redirect larger meanings. These steps are meant to be simple and repeatable. They honor the archive's twin themes, wonder tied to responsibility. Ethics, misuse, and the erosion of sensitivity. No appreciation of Cayce's material is complete without a sober look at misuse. The archives record a steady theme. Gifts tied to ego, commerce, or manipulation decline. When a person seeks attention rather than care, when they monetize fear, or use dream knowledge to control others, sensitivity dulls. Cayce, in his readings, framed this not as heavenly punishment but as natural consequence. Self-serving use of spiritual tools erodes the channels that supplied them. There are many modern temptations: online visibility, charismatic branding, the easy architecture of influence. If you find your nocturnal gift seducing you toward publicity, pause. The archive's remedy is simple and demanding. Restitute, step back from spectacle, re-anchor in small acts of service, and seek mentorship. Repeated readings advise accountability, trustworthy peers, ethical training, and the humility to accept correction. Another ethical consideration is verification. The archive does not recommend that anyone accept spiritual claims on the basis of one dream.
Verify, test, and require community corroboration when a dream appears to instruct action that affects others. Cayce's counsel points to a blend of inner fidelity and outward prudence. Finally, the archive stresses that spiritual practice should never replace medical or psychological treatment. If your nocturnal awakenings come with severe anxiety, sleep paralysis, cognitive difficulty, or physical symptoms, seek professional care. Spiritual practice complements care. It does not substitute for it. A case of decline and repair from the archives. There is a cautionary tale preserved among the readings of an individual who initially received frequent, clarifying dreams. The person began to build a modest following, charging for consultations and cultivating an image of specialness. Over time, the dream imagery became muddled. Insights dried into cliches. A later reading suggested that the decline was proportional to the shift in motive. When service turned into commerce, the sensitivity waned. The remedy recommended in the archive was not dramatic excommunication, but repair. The individual was advised to close public consultation for a year, volunteer anonymously, deepen study, and seek accountability from spiritual peers. After a period of quiet service and study, the dreams returned, clearer and less self-focused. The archive uses this story to underline a recurring theme. Gifts thrive in a soil of humility and usefulness. A personal challenge. If you wake at 3-4 a.m., start here. If this message has landed so that you now suspect the veil is thin for you, here is a concrete challenge grounded in the archive's cumulative advice. For the next 30 days, commit to 3 practices. 1. Keep your bedside recorder or notebook active and capture every notable nocturnal image. 2. Spend at least 10 minutes daily in humble attunement. Read, pray, or sit with a phrase that orients you to love and service. 3. Each week, perform one anonymous, ordinary act of care. Bring soup to a neighbor, tutor a child, give an hour to a community clinic. After 30 days, review your journal. Look for patterns, practical nudges, and points where nocturnal material translated into helpful action. Share one honest entry in the comments below, not for spectacle, but to build a community of careful witnesses. A final word on the modern test. Cayce's readings often circle back to a moral demand. The modern era amplifies both opportunity and temptation. The archival projection about 1998 to 2025 is less about a date and more about pressure. Technologies, fast communication, and global interdependence increase the scale at which gifts can be used for good or ill. The archive's tempering message is clear. If the veil thins for you in that quiet hour, your first question should always be practical and ethical. How does this make me more useful? How does this relieve suffering? How does this draw me closer to the simple, strenuous work of loving my neighbor?
The closing image the archive often returns to is not dramatic, but domestic. A table where hands are washed, a room where the sick are soothed, a child taught to read. Cayce's readings, taken together, will not satisfy those who hunger for spectacle. They will, however, provide a steady map for those who wish to channel nocturnal openings into a life of ordinary holiness. a gentle reassurance, and the last invitation. If you have been waking between 3 and 4 in the morning, and this message resonates, remember 2 things the archives insist on. First, discernment matters. Second, love matters more. Gifts are given not to elevate one person, but to lift the common life. Your dreams can be a training room for compassion. Before we close, a practical reminder. If your nighttime awakenings are accompanied by persistent distress, cognitive disruption, or physical symptoms, consult medical and mental health professionals. Spiritual work and clinical care are companions, not competitors. If this archive-based exploration has felt helpful, take one small action now. Write down the most vivid image from your most recent thin-hour waking and consider one tiny act you could do by tomorrow that embodies service in response. If you're willing, share that line in the comments below. One sentence, one act. Your testimony, held lightly and honestly, may help another discern. Thank you for walking with these archival accounts a while longer. If you would like more explorations of Cayce's readings, carefully explained and connected to practical steps, consider subscribing and returning for future videos. Share this with someone who wakes at night. You might be offering them the first map they need. May the thin hour for you be an education and mercy, not a pursuit of rarefied status. May your gifts, whether they sing in dreams of flight, water, temple, or light, find their clearest expression in small, steady acts of love. If the veil is thin where you lie awake, let what appears pull you toward compassion. Let it lead you to wash hands, to feed, to teach, and to listen. That is the highest use the archives recommend. That is the work Cayce, according to the readings, returned to again and again, the cultivation of a life that loves with clarity, discipline, and humility. If this message reached something inside you, one more practical step. Subscribe for more archive-based teachings, and if you feel safe, leave a brief comment with one nightly image and one small action you will take this week. Share this with someone who wakes between 3 and 4. They may find in it a call to begin, slowly and responsibly, a life of service.